Okay, hello and welcome back to another episode of Frank Wealth Insights. I'm Danielle Kelly.
And I'm Chelsea Hussey. Frank is off on a much needed break this week, so today Danielle and I will be leading the show as temporary co-hosts.
Yes, so this episode is going to focus on planning for our aging parents before decisions feel urgent. So our goal is to provide a thoughtful framework that supports coordination, communication, and preparation as needs evolve. We'll also share a resource at the end of this episode that will help you begin organizing these manageable conversations in a very clear way. So before going any further, I do need to offer a quick reminder. This podcast episode is for general purposes only. It does not constitute financial, legal, or tax advice. Listeners should consult their own qualified professionals regarding their individual circumstances before making any decisions. So Chelsea, we see this with families all the time. So we often have, the younger generation managing their own finances. And then they're tasked with also managing the finances and the financial decisions for their parents. Okay.
Yeah.
We do try to prepare for this a lot. And, we always stress to clients how important it is to have these conversations ahead of time, just because, it can take so much of the pressure off, when the moment becomes urgent. So, why do we think that, even though we stress how important it is to have these conversations early on, why do we think it still kind of gets pushed down the road a little bit?
There's definitely a lot to balance. Sometimes that generation who's dealing with both aging parents and raising their own kids, we sometimes call them the sandwich generation, right? They've got a couple different things that they're balancing and dealing with. But yeah, there are a lot of hangups that can prevent people from taking some of those initial steps, exploring why it can get delayed. For your experience, why have you seen it get pushed down the road a little bit?
What I hear most of the time is, my parents are fine right now. And that becomes the basis of planning. So my parents are happy, my parents are fine. And a lot of the time, I do feel like that is from, it comes from the emotional aspect of it, okay? My parents are happy. I don't want to make them upset by having these conversations. And it just becomes kind of uncomfortable for maybe the kids, the grandkids, whoever's in that place taking care of those parents. So, the everything is fine as it is probably the biggest, sentence I hear with our clients. How about you?
Part of it, and we see this generationally, so many more people live further away from their parents. There's a lot of sibling dynamics and family dynamics to take into account, and so there's a lot of family coordination that goes on. Sometimes there can be the assumption like, well, you live closest to mom, so I assumed that if there was an emergency or something that came up, that you would be naturally the one to take care of her. Or, well, you're the oldest sibling, so I kind of view you as the grown-up in the family. So, we hope that you'll take charge. And so there might not be a ton of communication in how that gets coordinated. And on the parents' side too, similarly, they may just, you might have that dad that makes a joke like, just put me in a pine box and I'll be good. I don't need to plan for that kind of stuff. They sort of brush it off and joke a little bit. And families want to be respectful as they talk about this. But it can be a very delicate kind of subject because you have to get a little bit morbid to really get the honest conversations.
Yeah, and I would say that 90% of people don't even know where to begin, because there's so many things to think about. There's so many complexities that it's not a conversation we have over the dinner table a lot of the time. So just knowing where to begin, I feel like, is the first step to having these difficult conversations. So let's just talk about families, when they start having these conversations, they might feel a little bit stuck. Okay. So what are the most common barriers you see when people are getting stuck in the conversation phase? We can talk about, the lack of clarity on coordination. So I'll let you chat about that a little bit.
Yeah. So, as I shared, I think there might be some communication gaps or issues among the siblings. Also, not knowing what you don't know. Some people might assume mom and dad are pretty well set up. They probably have these things buttoned up. So this might not be a conversation we need to have right now. And like we said before, it can be kind of a sensitive topic. but not knowing what your parents have or what all steps they may have taken already, or even who their primary contacts are, who their in case of emergency person is. In absence of that, when something does come up, all of this planning then becomes a matter of urgency.
I tell every single person I meet with, I say, not having a shared system is probably one of the biggest barriers to, caring for parents and aging and estate planning. So, I think let's just chat. Let's talk about a shared system. I think having something in place that everybody knows about will clear up that uncertainty between maybe the siblings or whoever is taking care of them. So having something that everybody knows about, it's in a common place, it can be updated as needed, is so important. Okay, and I think I saw this. There's so many different packets that you can get to help you with this. Okay, and I tell my clients, if you just go on Amazon or if you're online, there's something called the When I Die folder or booklet. Okay, and as morbid as it sounds, having a file with every single piece of information that, the people who are going to be taking care of your wishes after you pass is probably the most important thing. So, I get it. Families want to, be respectful, but there also should be that structure in place. Do you see any other barriers? Or maybe let's talk about common issues maybe between familial relationships.
Sure. So some of it can be, again, who puts the responsibility on whom. Not knowing who the primary contacts would be, your parents' estate planning attorney, who their CPA is, their financial advisor, not knowing who some of their doctor. It's important to be aware of some of that, because when things do become very urgent, you have to then scramble to look up who the emergency contacts are, or what medications is my mom on right now that EMS should be aware of. And this is especially true if you have parents where maybe there's either a divorce or a remarriage, or one of them is a widow or a widower. There might not be the same support structure that they're used to, or different power dynamics coming into play, where maybe mom's new husband, he tends to want to step up and take responsibility, but maybe that's not to the same extent or the level of care or the type of care that you might want for her as well. So there's a lot of these different dynamics at play when there's blended families or just differences among families. Like I said, geographical differences as well. But when things become urgent, that's where we have to go down that list of, all right, who's the doctor? Do I need to be aware of any conflicting medications, any wishes of my parents? Who's kind of on that list of who should know right away, and who can wait a little bit, and what all is in place.
Yep. And I'm sure you see this all the time. So, let's say, husband and wife have 4 kids. And, generally speaking, the one who lives geographically the closest to the parents might take on the most responsibilities. And, the other kids are out of state working, doing their own thing. I see this more often than not, where, the child or the person who is the executor of a lot of the time has to handle so many stressful conversations with the other siblings. And that can often, lead to, that sibling being the bad sibling and, maybe, not doing things exactly as the other siblings want, and creating a really, really hard and tough family dynamic. So, I totally agree. Just having that support in place is so much more important than we think, just from a family perspective and from, more of a peacekeeping perspective as well.
Absolutely. And I think with that, there's a few different ways that I think we can encourage our clients or people that we know who go through this to have some of those proactive conversations. And it's not just among the siblings, but among the siblings and the parents as well. Like you were saying, maybe that kind of default sibling who is the executor, which as something that interesting that I learned recently is a lot of people tend to think that the executor is the person who gets to control all the money and has all the fun with those post-mortem decisions. truly, it's a huge responsibility. And I think for among a lot of siblings, I think it's important to know that whoever takes on that mantle, it's a significant responsibility. It doesn't mean that you inherit everything or that you get all the responsibility because you're the favorite, but because you've got some duties to exercise.
I've seen, I talk to different, it is tough being the executor for an estate. It can take, months to years even, and it is a lot of work.
Yeah.
So, that's something that the executor agrees to beforehand, and hopefully it's, communicated well throughout the whole process so there's no big surprises.
Yes, exactly.
You brought this up earlier, and I just want to kind of touch on it a little bit more because I feel like it is very, very important and often, not thought of, okay? So, we're talking about avoiding these conversations when it becomes urgent. So really, why is that so important, Chelsea? And maybe we just start off like from a strictly medical perspective. When medical events happen, timelines shorten. Decisions need to be made now. Decisions need to be, properly made following the direction of your parents or whoever you're, put in charge of taking care of their well-being. So other than medical events being urgent, how does that add on to the emotional stress that this, causes for people?
Well, depending on the nature of the event, that alone has its own sense of urgency. But then if there isn't any sort of clear line of communication of where certain documents are located or how to access, if let's say we need to access somebody's health insurance card. I mean, it can be as simple as that, but where are all the documents? What do we need to know? Who needs to be contacted? That scramble to find all of that when you're in the midst of a very stressful situation where you're concerned about a loved one, that can definitely add on that emotional stress.
And even just reading through these documents beforehand is extremely important because we've all seen legal jargon and, sometimes I look at estate planning documents and I'm like, what is the, what's the purpose for this? How is this to be read and understood? So even just having read through those documents before and then maybe having a quick conversation with them about it is probably one of the better things to do, and a lot of people aren't doing it.
Absolutely. I don't know if you've seen those, I think it's LegalZoom, but those commercials where somebody says, I'd want you to watch my kids if anything happens to me, and someone pops up and says, doesn't count because you just said it. You didn't put it in writing. And just the documentation process alone, having something that's written out, it's clear, it's unambiguous, that's a huge, huge step.
Yep. And it can also, and I will say from an emotional aspect, okay, being put in charge of making these decisions on another person's behalf can sometimes, be, awful. Okay. So, let's say that, one of your parents has, a specific order. If this happens to me, then, I want this to happen. And, you want to feel comfortable knowing that you're making the right person on their behalf. And you might, as the executor or as the power of attorney or the medical power of attorney, that's not an easy thing to do. So you need to be comfortable with, following their wishes and saying, okay, if this happens, then I'm going to dutifully execute this next task and then this next task. So it can, it takes out some of the emotional aspect when you're strictly following their wishes and what they want to be done. So.
Exactly.
So Chelsea, we've talked about the different pressures and the different barriers. And, as I said before, having a structure in place is, so wildly important when it comes to, caring for your aging parents and, the estate part of life. So let's just talk through what a practical structure actually looks like. So, I think really the first important thing is truly starting with values before documents. So, why do you think that's so important, Chelsea?
Well, I think it comes down to maybe the nitty-gritty of medical care, but it might be something like what's important to me, to my legacy, and how I want to be remembered. When I'm gone, do am I donating my body to science? Do I have a do not resuscitate? What do I really want to play out in some of those worst case scenarios? Again, these can be uncomfortable conversations to have, but having them ahead of time is very crucial because, again, it prevents that emotional stress in the moment. But knowing what that person values, you can then begin to line up plans.
It's huge. Okay, so values before documents.
Yes.
So, let's also talk about, maybe viewing these conversations as supportive as opposed to being more of a control aspect. So, we want to feel like, with everyone in our lives, we have conversations with people we love because we're here to support them. But, sometimes it can be taken from parents as, my kids are trying to control what I do and, making them upset. So, let's talk about how maybe we can, move this from a control aspect over to a support aspect.
I think part of it is starting with those very clear intentions and having the conversations way before there's something that sparks it. Yeah. Even having a conversation like this initiated well before a parent has a fall, where maybe it's nothing that's super serious, but you've had it ahead of time, so it then removes a little bit of that sting or that embarrassment from the parent of, oh, you think I'm getting old, you just want to control me, or something like that. And it's funny because as it is a huge leap, I think, for parents to move into feeling now they're being cared for by their children, these people that they raised. It is important to begin with, Mom, Dad, what do you want to make sure happens? And how can then we set up a framework to support it?
And I mean, I saw these conversations when my parents were talking with my grandparents for the first time. So, it wasn't easy, but, as there's certain things you can do and there's certain things you just can't do. So, for example, adding a stair assistance into an elderly couple's house, saying, like, if it becomes hard for you to walk up the stairs, then we do this. If this is happening, then we put this procedure into place immediately. So, I guess that is important. Just, making sure they feel supported in, living how they want to live, but within certain boundaries. And another thing you said was identifying all essential information. So, you mentioned CPAs, attorneys, and financial advisors. We usually call that the trifecta. Okay, these are really the first three people, or not really the first three people, but if anything should happen to an aging parent, you need to make sure that you first contact these three people. Why is that so important?
Well, depending on that person or their role, if there's the CPA, there might not be anything super time sensitive, but if it happens during tax season, or if there's a material difference on timing for certain documents or when things might get filed, that's certainly important. With estate planning attorneys, it's crucial to reach out because there are many estate planning attorneys out there who also have a discipline in elder care law. And within elder care law, there actually are a few different branches. There's pre-crisis planning, which they actually consider anything up to 5 years before somebody might move into assisted living or something like that. So that's very proactive planning. But then there's also crisis planning. How do we coordinate if we have to rely on, start the clock on Medicare or Medicaid? And then, of course, your financial advisor is crucial too, because they're likely you have your assets with them. If you have a financial power of attorney who you need to make decisions in your stead, you want to make sure that your advisor is looped in. And oftentimes, with your relationship with the advisor, they also are connected with the rest of your team, your estate planning attorney and your CPA, so they can be a great touch point. And lastly, they tend to know if they're the one who also helped you set up your long-term care insurance, if that's something. That's all important pieces to know because they can sort of quarterback that situation for you.
And we see this all the time. Usually, having these documents executed is one thing, but actually implementing them is a whole different thing. And I'm talking about, financial power of attorneys. I'm talking about, different documents that you might have in place giving another person authority to make decisions on your behalf. A lot of the times, people don't even know that they need to, send these to institutions beforehand. So if something does happen, they're actually able to act on that account, because a lot of times people just think that they have it and that's good enough. But one important thing to remember is that we need to be sending these to our different emergency contacts to say, hey, if there's another document that needs to be signed on top of the actual financial power of attorney, then let's get that taken care of before anything happens. So that is another important consideration.
You'd mentioned too with housing considerations, I think if you were to ask most people, what are your long-term healthcare goals are, they would say, I want to stay in my house as long as humanly possible.
Yes.
But apart from modifications to the home, what are some other steps people might take or considerations they may have for themselves or for their aging parents?
Some of the big housing considerations we see, aside from modifications, which are very, very important, that people start doing these things ahead of time, because we know this, hiring a contractor for anything can take months and months and months. So having these done before someone falls or someone can't walk up the stairs is generally the key. So other housing considerations, we have a lot of conversations with our clients around downsizing. They had kids at one point and it's just them living in the house. It's a 4-bedroom house. That's a lot of extra work for them to be, taking care of, 3 unused bedrooms and, the maintenance that comes along with that. From a financial standpoint, downsizing could be a really good decision financially, just because, we all know property taxes are going up and, just really the cost of everything is continuing to rise. So from a financial perspective, it doesn't make sense for, a couple who has nobody living at home to maybe have a massive house that they're, in charge of handling. Another housing consideration is, perhaps having conversations with your parents or your loved ones about eventually what would their decision be on moving to an assisted living facility. Chelsea, I'm sure you hear this all the time, but clients want to live in their houses as long as they can, and they really, really, really try to avoid those conversations about moving to a facility or moving to some sort of care. What do you hear regarding those conversations?
Yeah, well, I think and it's probably less common now, right? Because our aging parents have taken care of their parents, so they've become a little bit more familiar with what long-term care really is, But for a long time, it had the stigma of long-term care is you're in a small hospital-type room being cared for by a nurse. And really, there's so many more expansive types of care these days. A retirement community is a nice, easy step into an area where you're in a smaller space. Somebody's shoveling for you, which is really important, and plowing. Somebody's doing the lawn maintenance. Mm-hmm. You've got a community of like-minded or similarly lifestyled people to you, and a little bit of support there. And then assisted living is just a little bit more assistance, maybe medical staff on hand if there's anything that's needed. But there's ways to sort of step into having greater access to care, but still retaining a sense of independence prior to moving to something that feels a little bit more hospital-like. And I think understanding and helping parents understand the distinction of those can be a really helpful step into making sure that they're not delaying things too much or thinking, I could still mow my own grass or or something like that. Like, yes, but how about we take some of these next steps?
And we see it all the time. Like, there is sometimes like a negative connotation that comes along with, senior living. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I think, my husband's in real estate. So, I've seen some of these 65 plus communities. They are loaded with, cool stuff to do. They have, pools, different restaurants on site. Everyone drives around in golf carts. So, I think that there really needs to be, more positive conversations as to, hey, here's a community that, people have, there's all these activities to do. And you just don't have to take care of the stressful aspects of life, of living in your own house, of, going to get groceries every other day. Plowing the snow, especially like being here in Cleveland, Ohio. We had the craziest snow year, I feel like, of all time this year.
Yeah.
So, that is something important to think of. Another important thing is that we really need to keep these conversations ongoing instead of just a one-time conversation. It's not a conversation we're having at Thanksgiving dinner, but it should be had more than once because people's wishes change. Okay. And if we're not constantly checking in, how are you feeling? Have there been any changes since we maybe last spoke about this? How can that help in this aging process?
Well, I think a great way to set up a cadence for reviewing this, and this is something that we offer to a lot of our clients, is we'll encourage them to have one of their annual review meetings with us to be with their family, or maybe with their trusted person, or their if it's their oldest child or whoever, but beginning to loop the whole family into the situation, because what a good financial planner does is says, all right, well, let's review then your current income and expenses, and where are we drawing resources from right now? Is it mostly coming from the portfolio? Is this a little bit of pension and Social Security? And so having a good idea of your parents' cash flow situation, how healthy their balance sheet is, what are some of these resources can be very helpful. Understanding how liquid they are. So if there is a sudden large expense that comes up, who are we calling first? Where is that money located? Am I running over to the bank to do this? Do I call my parents' advisor? I want to make sure I can, again, deal with this for them. And then also coordinating those estate planning documents. It's a good rule of thumb to update your estate planning documents at least every 5 years, if not more. When there's a life-changing event, marriage, death, divorce, a significant inheritance, something that's happened that's materially changed the financial picture, you should be connecting with your estate planning attorney to get that updated. That's something that we're often holding our clients accountable to, making sure that they're checking in and doing that regularly, even if it's just to make sure, does this still reflect what we were thinking of 5 years ago or when we first established it? So when you have an idea of what all of that is for your parents, you are now, one, it's revealed a huge layer of trust, because there are some families where traditionally parents kind of kept finances a bit separate from their kids because they just weren't ready to loop them in. Bringing in your children into the financial planning process as an aging parent, a great sign of trust. It helps establish what your situation looks like so they know best how well covered you are, or if there are any gaps or overlaps that you should be aware of.
I mean, that's hugely important. And I know, having that required annual check-in is, we go over that all at every meeting. Just, has anything changed? Is there anything else we, from a financial aspect, need to be aware of? And I have noticed that, bringing their loved ones into meetings, it creates so much better of a flow. Okay. And, we don't want to be meeting someone's kids for the first time if something, tragic happens.
Absolutely.
And, it's more beneficial that, you have these joint conversations, and it makes your child a lot more times more comfortable with, dealing with the decisions, and maybe dealing with, receiving a large sum of money. And are they going to have the education that they need behind that to feel comfortable accepting that money? So, teaching, the basics early on before anything happens is extremely important.
Absolutely. Now, Danielle, in your experience, what do you think families often overlook that later affects a healthy coordination of all of this?
So often things that are overlooked, and this is from my experience and working with these clients, and talking with their families, and I guess from my own perspective with my parents and grandparents. So a couple things that are overlooked are the decision authority, and it's not clear who is going to be handling the estate issues. So, that's a huge hurdle, is just not having clear expectations of, I might put this child in charge of this thing, this child in charge of another thing. So maybe everybody feels involved, but at least they know that this is my responsibility, and they will, carry that out if something should happen to you. Another important aspect is, we've talked about this so many times, but early preparation here is key, okay? And having these things established beforehand can make for such a smooth transition.
Absolutely. And I think it helps to, going back to a cadence of meeting, is if you've got sort of a neutral third party there, that helps balance out those conversations. So going back to what we said before, you begin with values, and I think that's a conversation that should occur among the family. And then as you bring in a professional to talk through things, that helps create a little bit of can reduce some of the emotional friction that might come up, and say, all right, here's the healthcare power of attorney is sibling 1. My executor is actually going to be sibling 2. When it's clearly laid out like that, I think it's very helpful. Yeah. And to your point, I think there's these moments that come up where in those times of stress, certainly the first time, you don't want the first time you're meeting somebody to be in that crazy situation, or the first time that you connect or talk to your parents' financial planner.
Yep. And I think maybe the last hurdle is not having a designated spot for these documents. And, I have had examples. I'll give you a couple examples here. One of my clients' sons passed away, and every estate planning document he had was on his computer. And they get the computer, it is almost impossible for them to, they have no idea what the password is. They've called Apple. Apple cannot share anything with them. So, printing these documents out is the first step in having a designated file cabinet or a safe that everybody knows the code to. It's crucial.
Yeah.
And we see, just having statements in one place, having all of your estate planning documents in one place, having the password for your devices is also huge. We hear it all the time where people can't get into their loved ones' phones because they did not know the password. Apple and Android, I don't want to leave out Android. They actually have what they call a legacy contact now, that you can add somebody as the legacy contact that, should someone pass away, they have it on file with Apple that once you send in that person's death certificate to Apple, they will release the password and all of the information in someone's phone to that designated individual. I think that's huge.
Absolutely. Yeah. Technology can play a huge part in streamlining things.
A little bit more on why early preparation matters. I think it's huge, the saying that preparation creates options.
Absolutely. Long-term healthcare planning is really an inevitability. It's something that whether you pass away peacefully at home at age 100, or with a very nicely modified home, or you're in the care of a skilled nursing facility for 10 years with Parkinson's, at some point your assets are going to have to cover that, or will be used in some sort of long-term healthcare situation. Now, there's planning by default, which is whatever I have will sort of cover this, or there's planning a little bit more by design, which is this is what I'd like to use to address each of these different types of expenses through my retirement. And really the most proactive way to address this is pre-retirement planning, because one of the tools you can use to transfer that risk is through insurance. The problem with insurance, though, is that the closer you get to actually needing it, the more expensive and more difficult it is to get. Yes. So you really want to get that much sooner rather than later. And being really familiar, and this is really key with your wealth advisor, is being familiar with the terms of those long-term care insurance contracts, because some of them will have a different, it's a deductible, but it's an elimination period. So for example, this insurance will begin covering this cost of care after day 90 of you needing assistance with 2 of the 6 activities of daily living, and that can be dressing yourself, feeding yourself, bathing yourself, getting up, walking, and so on, or a cognitive impairment. And so once that clock starts, that's important to note because that then creates that countdown of okay, when can we expect these benefits to come in? And are these benefits reimbursements to us and we're spending the money ahead of time? Or are we receiving the funds ahead of time and are we receiving them for a daily cost of care or monthly? All of these pieces go into being familiar with that contract and making sure that you, your planner, and of course your family are on the same page as to when you use it, how you use it, and how the funds will be sent out.
I mean, that's huge. And I mean, it goes along with, even just making sure, beneficiary information stays current. All of your accounts are titled properly. Your life insurance has the proper beneficiaries and, it's specified, what you want to have happen with your life insurance proceeds. Is it, could it be used to offset burial costs? Did you want to throw a party at the very end? So having those things planned out is, it's huge.
Absolutely. For families who are thinking this would be helpful but are unsure of where to begin, we've created a plan of care guide. It is an educational resource designed to help families organize these conversations and clarify roles before decisions feel urgent. You can request a copy by reaching out to our team at rol@returnonlifewealth.com.
And it really does provide a starting point without overwhelming families. And, it really supports more thoughtful coordination over time. These conversations are ultimately about dignity, respect, and support. They're about honoring our loved ones' preferences while strengthening family communication. Preparation does not eliminate all uncertainty, but it often helps reduce confusion.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you believe the plan of care guide would be helpful for your family, please feel free to reach out to our team at Return on Life Wealth Partners.
Until next time, thanks everybody.